He was the man who said he would die before he ever betrayed his friend. And then, that same night, he denied even knowing him 3 times while his friend was being beaten and condemned a few steps away. He was the man who tried to walk on water and sank the moment he looked down. The man who drew a sword to defend his master and then ran away in the dark. The man who was loud, impulsive, brave and cowardly, faithful and faithless, often in the very same hour. His name was Simon, a rough fisherman from a small town on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus looked at this loud, flawed, ordinary working man and gave him a new name, Peter, the rock, and said, "On this rock I will build my church." How does a man go from sinking in the waves, from denying his Lord 3 times in one night, to becoming the rock on which the entire church was built? How does the greatest failure among the disciples become their greatest leader? That is the story we are going to tell. The complete life of Peter, from a fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee to the day he gave his own life for the friend he once denied. It is, more than any other story in the Gospels, a story about failure and about being forgiven and about what God can do with a broken, ordinary man who loves him. Built from the Gospels, the book of Acts, and the earliest traditions of the church, this is the complete life of Simon Peter, from fisherman to the rock of the church. And it begins, as his life began, on the water. Simon was born in a fishing town called Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, and later settled in nearby Capernaum. He was not a scholar. He was not a priest. He was not rich or educated or important. He was a fisherman, one of the hardest, roughest, most physically grueling trades in the ancient world. Picture his life. He worked at night when the fish came near the surface, casting and hauling heavy nets for hours in the dark, in the cold, in all weather. He came home at dawn, exhausted, to mend the nets and sell the catch. His hands were scarred and rope-burned. His face was weathered by sun and wind. His back ached. This was the life he had been born into, and the life he expected to die in. He was married. The Gospels mention his mother-in-law, whom Jesus would later heal. He had a brother, Andrew, who fished alongside him. He was, by every measure, an ordinary working man. Loud, probably. Quick-tempered, certainly, as we will see. The kind of big, blunt, hard-working man you would find in any fishing village in any age. Generous and impulsive, brave and rough around the edges. He knew the scriptures, as every devout Jew did. He had grown up with the prophets and the promise of a coming Messiah. But he was not the kind of man anyone would have picked to change the world. He had no platform, no education, no standing. If you had walked through Capernaum and pointed at Simon the fisherman and said, "That man will become the most important leader of a movement that conquers the Roman Empire," people would have laughed. And that is exactly the point. Because one ordinary morning, after a long night of catching absolutely nothing, a traveling teacher walked down to the shore where Simon was washing his empty nets. And that teacher was about to turn the fisherman's entire life upside down. But let us sit one more moment in the world Simon came from, because it explains so much of who he became. The Sea of Galilee was the center of his entire existence. It fed his family. It set the rhythm of his days and nights. He knew its sudden, violent storms, the way the wind could come howling down from the hills without warning and turn calm water into a death trap in minutes. He had probably lost people he knew to that water. He respected it and feared it the way only a man who works the sea can. And he was a man of the body, not the book. His authority came from his strength, his skill with the nets, his knowledge of where the fish ran. He was used to being the expert on this water. He was used to being in control of his own boat, his own trade, his own life. Remember that. Because the man Jesus was about to call was a man who knew how to be in charge, and who would have to learn, painfully over and over, how to follow instead. His name was Jesus, and he was about to ask Simon to leave everything he had ever known. The Gospel of Luke tells the story beautifully. Jesus had been teaching, and the crowds were pressing in on him by the shore. So he got into Simon's empty boat and asked him to push out a little from the land, so he could teach the crowd from the water. Simon, exhausted from a fruitless night, did it. And when Jesus finished teaching, he turned to the tired fisherman and said something that, to a professional, must have sounded almost foolish. "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon's reply is so human you can hear the tiredness in it. "Master, we toiled all night and caught nothing. We are the fishermen here. We tried. There are no fish." But then, and this is the first glimpse of the man's heart, he added, "But at your word, I will let down the nets." And the nets came up so full of fish that they began to break. Simon had to signal his partners in the other boat to come help, and both boats were so loaded with fish they began to sink. And Simon's reaction tells you everything about him. He did not celebrate the windfall. He fell down at Jesus' knees, overwhelmed, and said, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." He was a rough, ordinary man, suddenly aware that he was in the presence of something holy, and his first instinct was that he was not worthy of it. And Jesus said the words that would change the course of his life. "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And here is the astonishing thing. The Gospel says that Simon and his brother and their partners brought their boats to land, left everything, and followed him. Left everything. Think about what that means. The boats, his livelihood, probably worth a fortune to a working family. The nets, the business, the security, the only life he had ever known. He walked away from all of it, on the spot, to follow a traveling teacher he had only just met. Why? What did he see in Jesus that was worth abandoning everything? We are not fully told. But this is the impulsive, all-in heart of Peter on display for the first time. When this man committed, he committed completely. He did not do anything by halves. He left everything and followed. And think about what that decision actually cost a man like Simon. He was not a young man with nothing to lose. He had a wife. He had a household, a mother-in-law under his roof, responsibilities. He had a trade that supported them all. Walking away from the boats meant walking away from the family security, gambling everything on a teacher he had known for a single morning. It was reckless. It was enormous. It was exactly the kind of all-or-nothing leap that would define Peter for the rest of his life. And there is something deeply hopeful in who Jesus chose. He did not go to the temple and recruit the most learned scholars. He did not seek out the wealthy or the powerful or the well-connected. He walked down to a beach and called a rough, loud, impulsive fisherman with calloused hands and no education. God's greatest work, again and again, begins not with the impressive, but with the ordinary, with the people the world overlooks. Simon the fisherman was nobody. And Jesus saw in him the rock the whole church would be built on. And from that day, the fisherman became a disciple. He would spend the next 3 years closer to Jesus than almost anyone. And in those 3 years, he would soar to the highest heights of faith and crash to the lowest depths of failure. Of all the 12 disciples Jesus gathered, 3 formed an inner circle: Peter, James, and John. And of those 3, Peter was always first named in every list of the disciples, first to speak, first to act, first to leap, often before he had thought it through. he witnessed things almost no one else did. When Jesus raised a dead girl back to life, Peter was in the room. When Jesus was transfigured on a mountain, his face shining like the sun, Moses and Elijah appearing beside him, Peter was one of only 3 who saw it. And true to form, Peter immediately blurted out a half-formed idea about building 3 shelters because he did not know what else to say. The Gospel even notes gently that he spoke out of sheer terror and did not know what he was saying. That was Peter, always present, always passionate, always speaking first, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes foolishly. He was the disciple who said the most right things and the most wrong things, often within minutes of each other. And it was Peter who spoke the single most important confession in the Gospels. And Jesus responded with the words that would define Peter forever. "Blessed are you, Simon, and I tell you, you are Peter, Petros, the rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." The rough fisherman had been given a new name and an unimaginable destiny. The rock, the foundation. Imagine what that must have done to a simple working man, to be told by the one he now believed was the Son of God that the whole future would be built on him. But here is the thing about Peter. In almost the very next breath, he got it spectacularly wrong. When Jesus began to explain that he would have to suffer and die, Peter, impulsive as always, pulled him aside and rebuked him. "Never, Lord. This shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned and said something shocking. "Get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." From "you are the rock" to "get behind me, Satan," in minutes. That was the roller coaster of being Peter. Soaring faith and crashing failure over and over. He loved Jesus more loudly than anyone, and he stumbled more publicly than anyone. And the greatest stumble of his life was still to come. And there is something worth pausing on in that whiplash, because it is the very thing that makes Peter so easy to love. He was not a careful, measured man who weighed every word. He was the opposite. He led with his heart, blurted out what he felt, leapt before he looked. That same impulsive heart that produced the most magnificent confession in the Gospels also produced the rebuke that earned Jesus' sharpest correction. You cannot have one without the other. Peter's greatest strength and his greatest weakness were the same trait: a heart that was utterly, recklessly all in. And Jesus, knowing all of this, knowing Peter would soar and sink, confess and deny, leap and fall, chose him anyway, chose him as the rock. That is one of the quiet wonders of this whole story. Jesus did not wait for Peter to become steady and reliable before entrusting him with everything. He chose the impulsive, flawed, all-in fisherman exactly as he was, and built his church on him, failures and all. There is one story that captures the whole soul of Peter in a single moment. It happened on the Sea of Galilee, the water he knew better than anyone. It was night, and a violent storm had caught the disciples' boat far from shore. The waves were crashing, the wind was against them, and these experienced fishermen were afraid for their lives. And then, in the darkest part of the night, they saw something that terrified them even more. A figure walking toward them across the water. They thought it was a ghost. They cried out in fear. And then the figure spoke. "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." It was Jesus walking on the sea. And here is Peter, impulsive, passionate, all in Peter. While the others cowered, he called out, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Think about the sheer audacity of that. No one else even considered it. But Peter wanted to be where Jesus was, so badly that he was willing to step out of a boat onto a stormy sea. And Jesus said one word, "Come." And Peter did it. He climbed over the side of the boat and he stepped onto the water, and he walked. A fisherman, walking on the surface of the sea he had fished his whole life, toward his Lord. For a few steps, he did the impossible. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he walked on the storm. This is the glory of Peter, the man whose love and faith were so reckless that he alone, of all of them, got out of the boat. And then, this is the tragedy of Peter and the lesson of his whole life. He looked away. He saw the wind. He felt the waves. He took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the storm around him. And the moment he did, he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" That single scene is the entire life of Peter in miniature. The reckless faith to step out of the boat, the human weakness to look at the storm and sink, and the hand of Jesus always there, catching him before he drowns. Peter would step out and sink and be caught again and again for the rest of his life. And the greatest sinking was about to come, on the worst night of his life. But do not miss the lesson buried in that moment, because it is one of the most important in the whole gospel. Peter did not sink because his faith was fake. He sank because he took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the storm. As long as he looked at the Lord, he did the impossible. The moment he focused on the danger, he went under. And yet, even his failure was held safe, because the instant he cried out, the hand was there. He did not have to climb back into the boat on his own. He only had to call out, and he was caught. Think of how often we are exactly there, stepping out in faith, then overwhelmed by the size of the storm, the bills, the diagnosis, the fear, the impossible situation, and beginning to sink the moment we look at it instead of at God. Peter shows us both the danger and the rescue, the danger of looking down, and the promise that when we cry out, the hand is already reaching for us. No one sank further or was caught faster than Peter. It was the night before the crucifixion. At their last meal together, Jesus told the disciples that they would all fall away from him that very night. And Peter, loud, loyal, impulsive Peter, could not bear to hear it. "Even if they all fall away," he declared, "I will not. I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death." He meant it. With his whole heart, he meant it. This was not a lie. Peter genuinely believed he would die before he would ever abandon Jesus. And Jesus looked at the man he loved and said the saddest words. "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter could not accept it. "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." He insisted, and he believed it. And then the night came. Jesus was arrested in the garden. And true to form, Peter, the only one to act, drew a sword and struck, cutting off the ear of one of the men. He was ready to fight. He was ready to die swinging. But Jesus told him to put the sword away. And then the soldiers led Jesus off into the night, and the disciples scattered. But Peter, give him this, Peter did not run far. He followed at a distance into the courtyard of the high priest's house, where Jesus was being interrogated. He wanted to see what would happen to the man he loved. It was an act of courage that none of the others managed. And it was there, in that cold courtyard, warming his hands at a fire while he waited, that the bravest of the disciples broke. A servant girl looked at him and said, You also were with Jesus the Galilean." And Peter, the rock, the man who had sworn to die, said, "I do not know what you mean." A little later, another person recognized him. This man was with him. Again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath. "I do not know the man." And a third time, others insisted, "Certainly you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And Peter, terrified now, began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And at that moment, the rooster crowed. And the Gospel of Luke records the detail that breaks your heart. At that very moment, Jesus, being led across the courtyard, turned and looked at Peter. Their eyes met. The Lord he had sworn to die for, looking at him, just as the rooster crowed, just as he had foretold. And Peter remembered. He remembered the words at the table. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And the gospel says he went out and wept bitterly. The big, brave fisherman, the rock, the one who swore he would die first. He had denied his Lord 3 times in a single night, while that Lord was being condemned to death a few feet away. There is no lower point in the life of any disciple. Peter had failed as completely as a man can fail. And here is what makes Peter's denial so devastating and so human. He did not fail because he was a coward by nature. Remember? This was the man who got out of the boat, the man who drew his sword against an armed mob in the garden, the man who, unlike the others, actually followed Jesus into the enemy's courtyard. His courage was real. His love was real. His promise to die for Jesus was completely sincere. And yet, when the moment came, all of it crumbled before a servant girl's question. Not a soldier, not a judge, a servant girl pointing at him by a fire. And the bravest of them fell apart. That is the terrible truth Peter teaches us about ourselves. That we can mean every word of our promises to God with our whole heart and still break them when we are tired and afraid and cornered. The gap between who we want to be and who we are under pressure is the gap Peter fell into that night. And the cruelest part was that look. The gospel makes sure we know that Jesus turned and looked at Peter at the exact moment of the third denial. Not a look of anger. The gospels give no hint of anger. Something worse in a way. A look of sorrow. A look that said, "I knew, and I love you still." That look would haunt Peter for the rest of his life, and, as we will see, it would one day be healed by another look, across a charcoal fire on a beach. Try to imagine the next 3 days for Peter. Jesus was crucified. Peter was not at the cross. The Gospels place the women and the young disciple John there, but not Peter. Perhaps he could not face it. Perhaps the shame was too great. The man who had sworn to die with Jesus could not even stand at his cross. And then Jesus died and was buried. And Peter was left alone with the worst weight a human being can carry. The knowledge that someone he loved had died, and that the last thing he himself had done was deny ever knowing them. 3 times, with curses, while they suffered. There is a special agony in this kind of grief, grief tangled up with guilt. To lose someone is hard enough. To lose them while believing your last act toward them was betrayal is almost unbearable. Peter could never take it back now. Jesus was dead. There was no chance to apologize, no chance to make it right, no chance to prove that he really did love him after all. The denial would stand forever as the final word. That is where Peter was, not just grieving, drowning in a shame he believed could never be lifted. The rock had crumbled into dust. The man Jesus had said the church would be built on had proven himself a coward and a liar at the only moment that mattered. If the story ended there, Peter would be remembered as the great failure of the Gospels, the man who promised everything and delivered betrayal. But the story does not end there, because 3 days after the crucifixion, everything changed. And what Jesus did for Peter after the resurrection is one of the most beautiful acts of forgiveness ever recorded. On the 3rd day, the tomb was found empty. Jesus was alive. And one of the very first things the risen Jesus did was send a specific message. The angel at the tomb told the women, "Go, tell his disciples, and Peter." And Peter. Those 2 words must have meant everything to a man drowning in shame. Not just the disciples, but Peter by name, even after the denial, especially after the denial. The risen Jesus made sure his broken friend knew he was still included. But the full healing came later, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, the same water where it had all begun. Peter, not knowing what else to do with himself, had gone back to fishing, back to the old life. And after a night of catching nothing, a figure on the shore at dawn called out to them to cast their nets on the other side. And the nets came up overflowing. It was the same miracle as the day he was called. And John realized first, it is the Lord. And Peter, impulsive, all in Peter, did not wait for the boat. He threw himself into the water and swam to shore, desperate to reach Jesus. On the beach, Jesus had made a charcoal fire with fish and bread. And here the Gospel of John records a detail of exquisite tenderness. A charcoal fire. The only other charcoal fire mentioned in the Gospels is the one Peter warmed himself at in the courtyard, the night he denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus recreated the scene of the failure so that he could heal it. After they had eaten, Jesus turned to Peter, and 3 times, once for each denial, he asked him the same question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Tend my sheep." A third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And the Gospel says Peter was grieved that he asked a 3rd time, because the 3rd time surely brought back the 3rd denial. And he said, with everything in him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." 3 denials, undone by 3 declarations of love. Jesus did not scold him. He did not bring up the failure to shame him. He simply gave Peter the chance to replace each denial with a confession of love. And then he recommissioned him. "Feed my sheep. Take care of my people." The failure did not disqualify him. This is the heart of the entire story of Peter, and perhaps the most hopeful thing in the whole gospel. The greatest failure among the disciples was not cast aside. He was forgiven, healed at the very sight of his shame, and entrusted with everything. The rock that had crumbled was put back together by the hands of the one he had denied. And notice how Jesus did it, because the method is as beautiful as the mercy. He did not pull Peter aside privately and quietly forgive him. He did it on a beach, in front of the other disciples, in a way that publicly restored Peter's place among them. The denial had been public 3 times before witnesses in a courtyard. So the restoration was public too, 3 times before the others on the shore. Jesus did not just forgive the wound. He healed it completely, all the way down, undoing each denial with a declaration of love, leaving nothing broken behind. And there is one more detail that should not be missed. When Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" and Peter said yes, Jesus did not respond, "Then feel better." Or, "Then you are forgiven." He responded, "Feed my sheep." He gave Peter work to do. He restored him not into idle comfort, but into mission, into responsibility, leadership, purpose. Real forgiveness did not just wipe away the past, it handed Peter a future. That is the pattern of how grace works in this story. The failure is not held against him, and he is sent back out, trusted, to do the very work he was made for. The man who had once denied Jesus to a servant girl by a fire became, after Pentecost, the boldest preacher the world had ever seen. When the Holy Spirit fell on the disciples at Pentecost, it was Peter who stood up before the crowds in Jerusalem, the same city where he had denied his Lord just weeks before, and preached. And the Gospel says that 3,000 people believed and were baptized that single day. The fisherman had become a fisher of men, exactly as Jesus had promised. The change in him is staggering. The man who had crumbled before a servant girl now stood before the very rulers who had crucified Jesus, the same powerful men, and refused to be silenced. Arrested, threatened, flogged, thrown in prison, and every time he came back preaching more boldly than before. When the authorities commanded him to stop speaking about Jesus, Peter answered, "We must obey God rather than men." What happened to the coward in the courtyard? He was gone. The forgiveness on the beach and the power of the Spirit had transformed him completely. The same impulsive heart that once sank in the waves and denied his Lord was now an unbreakable rock. Exactly the name Jesus had given him. Peter led the early church through its first dangerous years. He performed miracles in Jesus' name. He was the one who first understood that the message was not only for the Jews, but for the whole world, opening the door of the church to all people. He was imprisoned by King Herod and, the book of Acts says, freed from his chains by an angel in the night. Again and again, he risked everything for the name he had once denied. Tradition tells us that in his later years, Peter traveled far from Galilee, eventually to the very heart of the empire that ruled the world. To Rome. The rough fisherman from a tiny lakeside town carried the message of Jesus into the capital of the most powerful empire on earth. And it was there, in Rome, that the story of Peter would reach its final test. Because the empire he had come to challenge was about to demand of him the one thing he had once failed to give, his life. And this time, Peter would not deny his Lord. Around the year 64 AD, a terrible fire devastated Rome. The Emperor Nero, cruel, unstable, and looking for someone to blame, turned on the small, growing community of Christians. A brutal persecution began. Christians were arrested, tortured, and killed in horrifying ways. And Peter was there, the leader of the Christians in Rome. An old man now, gray-bearded, far from the Sea of Galilee, where he had hauled nets as a young man. The fisherman had come a very long way. There is a beautiful tradition about Peter's final days. It says that as the persecution raged, the Christians of Rome begged Peter to flee the city, to save his life and preserve their leader. And Peter, persuaded, began to leave. But on the road out of Rome, the tradition says, he met a vision of Jesus walking toward the city. And Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus answered, "I am going to Rome to be crucified again." And Peter understood. He turned around. He went back into the city, back toward certain death, because this time he would not run. This time he would not deny his Lord. The man who had fled and denied on the worst night of his life walked willingly back toward his own cross. He was arrested and condemned to die by crucifixion, the same death his Lord had suffered. But tradition records one final, extraordinary detail. Peter asked to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Think about the full circle of that. The man who once said, "I am not worthy," when the nets first overflowed. The man who denied he even knew Jesus. Now, at the end, asking only that he not be allowed to die as grandly as his Lord. Because even now, even as a martyr, he counted himself unworthy of that honor. The humility and the love had become total. And so Peter died, not denying his Lord this time, but giving his life for him. The story that began with a denial ended with the ultimate confession, a man laying down his life for the one he loved. The rock held all the way to the end. Step back and look at the whole life. A rough, ordinary fisherman plucked from his nets. A man of reckless faith who stepped out of a boat onto a storm and sank. A man who swore he would die for his friend and then denied him 3 times before dawn. A man who wept bitterly in the dark, believing he had failed beyond all forgiveness. And then, a man forgiven on a beach, restored and transformed into the unbreakable rock on which the entire church was built. A man who died a martyr's death, asking only that he be considered unworthy to die as his Lord had. And here is why Peter's story matters to every single one of us. Because Peter is the patron saint of everyone who has ever failed. Everyone who has ever sworn to do better and then fallen short. Everyone who has ever looked at the storm instead of the Lord and started to sink. Everyone who has ever betrayed someone they love and wept in the dark, believing they could never be forgiven. Peter's life is the proof that failure is not the end of the story. That the hand of Jesus is always reaching out to catch the sinking. That there is no betrayal so deep it cannot be forgiven. No shame so great it cannot be healed. Jesus did not build his church on a perfect man. He built it on a man who failed catastrophically and was forgiven completely. That is the gospel in the life of one man. Not be perfect, but when you fall, and you will, there is a hand reaching out to catch you, and a charcoal fire on a beach where everything can be made new. From a fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee to a cross in Rome. From "Depart from me, I am a sinful man," to "Feed my sheep." From the man who denied his Lord to the man who died for him. That was the complete life of Peter, the rock that crumbled and was rebuilt and held to the very end. If this story of failure and forgiveness moved you, subscribe. We are telling the complete human lives behind the figures everyone thinks they already know, one at a time. Tell me in the comments which part of Peter's life hit you hardest. The day he left his nets? The night he walked on water and sank? The denial by the fire? The forgiveness on the beach? Or the death where he finally did not deny his Lord? I read every comment. Thank you for walking Peter's whole life with me. I'll see you in the next one.